I convinced Ethan in October 2019 that we should escape the perpetual grind of part-time jobs in college. We both love the great outdoors, so we rented a weekend trip for a hidden hiking trail in the Adirondacks. It was close enough to the campus that we could just drive there, and camping out under the stars seemed like the ultimate relaxation from all that. The concept was simple. I'd finish work at the bookstore at 4 p.m., and we'd head straight to the trailhead. Ethan, being the organizer that he is, brought all we'd need: tent, sleeping bags, food, cooking gear, and even something for us to relax after our long hike. He'd been an Eagle Scout, so I trusted that he'd not forget anything. We reached the trailhead at 5:30, but daylight was quickly running out. The hike started steeply, winding through dense woods that hemmed us in as the sun lowered. Each of us was carrying a heavy pack, and the incline was unyielding. When we finally reached the first shelter, a wooden cabin open on one end and about the size of a small tool shed, I was willing to collapse. The air was warm and sticky, and before long it was raining, first in a gentle patter, then in sheets. The rain dripped through my clothes, and a thick fog rolled in, clinging to the trees and making the trail slippery and treacherous. My body clung to me, cold and sodden, and every step was harder than the last. Despite this, we struggled on, hoping to reach the next hut before nightfall. By 8:30, we came across a split in our trail. The right-hand trail fell to a second shelter, and continuing on up the ridge had a beautiful view another mile and a half further on. Cold and wet to the shaking point, the choice was simple. Down to the shelter we went, relieved to spot its shadowy form in the rain. As we got there, a lantern's weak light told us we wouldn't be alone there. Inside, a couple sat on sleeping bags, their gear scattered here and there. They looked like they were in their early 60s, both of them dressed in mismatched outdoor gear. The man, Joe, was short with graying, thinning hair. The woman, Maya, was wiry and compact, with untidy gray hair and round glasses perched on her pointed nose. Joe greeted us warmly, offering us a towel to dry ourselves off with and a spot near the lantern to warm up. Maya was not so friendly, drinking from what looked like a water bottle but smelled sharply of alcohol. Her appearance made me uncomfortable. Her teeth were yellowed. Her clothes didn't quite fit on her body, and her eyes scanned the room as if searching for something intangible. As Joe and Ethan chatted about backpacking gear and past adventures, Maya spoke to me. She leaned closer, her breath foul and her voice commanding me to recite a tale. I had no idea what to tell her, so I told her the story of how Joe and I first met. But as soon as I started, she changed. She cut in, her tone hard and accusing, demanding to know why I would have said this. Stuck for a moment, I reminded her that Joe had said they'd met online. She bristled, her face clouding, and muttered something under her breath. Trying to lighten the mood, I asked her about her writing, something she had mentioned before. Her eyes flickered with a trace of a smile, and she swept her hands dramatically, saying she was a writer in her mind. The conversation wandered. She began to speak to herself, her words a jumbled mixture of sentences and queries. Her hands waved wildly around her, as if weaving invisible patterns in the air. Joe tried to calm her down, but Maya's behavior grew more and more unstable. She sprang up from her chair, shouting about calling out and some mention of witchcraft. Her voice echoed off the limits of the little hut, mingling with the unremitting rain outside. She subsided into her chair, then fixed Ethan and me with unnerving intensity, her black eyes fixed on us. We attempted to ignore her, but it was impossible to be at ease. She scolded Joe angrily under her breath, blaming him for giving her something. Acid, perhaps. Her voice cracked between a low growl and a harsh screech, and her movements were jerky and erratic. By then, I had my fist wrapped around Ethan's arm, my own heart racing. Maya would lie still for several minutes, then jolt upright suddenly, glare at us, and then collapse back onto the floor. With every movement she made, I felt another surge of terror. The shelter, designed to protect us from the elements, now felt like an entrapment. We knew we couldn't stay. Quietly, We packed our packs, not wanting to draw attention. Into the darkness and rain, we crept out, Maya observing us, her eyes glinting in the dim lantern light. We ascended as high as we could in the dark, eventually pitching our tent in a clearing far from the shelter. I spent hours lying awake, every creak of the leaves and snap of a branch making me freeze in fear. I couldn't help but remember Maya's face, her wild-eyed look focusing on us as we left. By the time morning broke, rain had stopped, but the sense of insecurity persisted. We dismantled camp in haste and left the trail, vowing never to again camp near strangers. The wild, lovely as it was, had never felt so unsecure. This happened just last summer. I and my best friend Caleb are both college students and the outdoor type. Whenever we could, we'd camp or hike. When summer break came, therefore, we decided that we would go on a 2-night camping trip by Clearview Lake, an enormous and secluded spot a few hours off campus. None of us thought that we were good campers, but we knew enough to be responsible. We were not irresponsible and kept our outings in the realm of safety. For this excursion, we packed everything that we needed: camping tents, rations, water, flashlights, a small first aid kit, and so on. We departed early in the morning, eager for our excursion. The hike to the lake took us longer than expected. It was tougher than the guide's indications had suggested. Despite this, at noon, we arrived at the lake. It was beautiful. The sun glittered over the water, and the wooded beach was peaceful, with no one else in sight. This was exactly what we had been searching for, a peaceful oasis far from the hustle and bustle of humans. After a quick stop to rest and take in the scenery, we camped along the line of trees a short distance from the beach. By the time our tents were erected, it was already getting dark. Caleb was able to acquire some firewood and get a fire going, while I chose to go pick up some sticks and tinder to fuel it for the night. As the sun strolled not far from our position, the air grew cool, and shadows stretched farther out across the forest floor. As I collected sticks, I heard something moving in front of me. I glanced up and gazed out into the fading light. At first, I thought that it would be something that an animal would do, but then I could make out the shape of a person working their way through the trees. The man was walking slowly, not on the beach or along a path one could see, but straight across the woods. It was strange. Most hikers would take marked paths. I hesitated there for a couple of seconds, unsure what to do. I then rushed back to camp and related the incident to Caleb. We weren't necessarily scared, but the encounter was odd. The lake was huge, with countless trails and campsites. What are the chances someone else is here, much less strolling through the forest right next to us? We tried to brush it off and cozied up by the fire when night fell. A few minutes later, we heard someone walking towards us in the darkness. A man stepped into the circle of light of our campfire, his face illuminated by its glow. He was in his 30s, with a shoulder-length mane and a scruffy beard. Something about him didn't quite feel right. He didn't appear to be an average hiker. The man smiled at us, but it was not right. It was almost like he was struggling too much to be friendly. He asked whether we could get to a particular trail. The name he mentioned didn't ring a bell, but it sounded like it could exist. I told him I didn't know, softly. The man hung around for another moment, looking at us. And then, without speaking, he turned and went back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Caleb and I exchanged uneasy glances. We couldn't make sense of it. The man didn't seem desperate, and his calm made everything seem all the more strange. If he'd truly been lost, wouldn't he have hung around to pay more questions or make some sense of his situation? We tried to explain the meeting logically, but the more we tried to force it, the more it didn't sound plausible. The tension grew throughout the evening. Eventually, we allowed conversation to drop off, letting the fire burn out before settling into our tents. Notwithstanding my fatigue, I couldn't sleep. The woods seemed too still, and I kept reliving the instant when the man had appeared. There was something about it that disturbed me. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, body tense and alert. Around 2 hours later, I heard it again, footsteps, but closer this time. My heart was pounding as I shouted for Caleb, grabbing my flashlight and dashing out of my tent. At the edge of the dimming circle of light, I spotted a figure standing approximately 10 feet from me. The instant that my flashlight beam landed on them, they turned and ran into the woods. They went with a speed that was nearly frantic and were gone in the darkness before Caleb had even stepped out of his tent. Caleb appeared at the very moment I heard receding footsteps. He didn't need me to explain to him what was happening. He knew something was amiss. We both packed up our gear as quickly and as unobtrusively as possible without a word. We didn't feel comfortable staying there for another minute. Dawn was still hours away when we finally geared up to leave. We headed back towards the large trailhead, huddled close together and taking turns with our flashlights to light the way. Any sound in the woods made us jump, and we didn't stop our movement until miles away from the lake. Even to this day, we never knew who that guy was or what he was looking for. Maybe he was just another camper, but the manner in which he acted didn't sit well with me. What troubles me the most is what might have happened had I not been observant. It was a lesson that neither of us will ever be able to forget. Hanging outside is supposed to be peaceful, but you can never be too careful when you are out of contact with help. I am near the Cascade Mountains in the Pacific Northwest. I don't get out camping as much as I used to, but I do get out at least once a year. I'm more of a sit in the backyard relax type these days, but there's just something about the wilderness that makes it worth the effort when I do get out. This incident occurred some years ago, during the early weeks of autumn. I'd planned a solo camping trip to a remote trail not far from my home. It was only a 25-minute drive to the small dirt parking lot where the trail began. I left my car, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and headed out. The air was cold, colder than I'd expected, but the trail itself was beautiful. The path wound its way through dense trees, the leaves just beginning to turn shades of orange and yellow. It was about an hour's walk before I reached the campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. There was no one else around, just as I had hoped. I shrugged off my pack, set up my tent, and sorted out my gear. Once I had all that arranged, I sat for a while and let the stillness of the woods close in around me. The sun was still high, so I decided to take advantage of the time and hike to a nearby overlook I had discovered online. It was only a 10-minute walk from camp, so I left most of my gear in camp and carried just a water bottle and day pack. The overlook did not disappoint. The view stretched out across the valley, the mountains rolling out in ridges to the horizon. I sat for nearly an hour, soaking up the quiet. By the time I returned to the campsite, something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but things didn't look quite the way I'd left them. My tent was unzipped, even though I was fairly certain I'd zipped it up before I'd gone out. Some of my belongings were slightly out of place, though nothing was missing. I thought I was just being paranoid. Maybe I'd been in a rush and hadn't zipped up the tent. Maybe the wind had moved things around. I shrugged off the sense of discomfort and focused on building a small fire pit as the sun dipped below the trees. The air quickly became colder, and I put on another layer of clothing before I boiled water to brew some tea. The fire crackled softly, the only sound to break the thick silence of the forest. An hour passed, and the silence was interrupted by the sound of crunching footsteps. They were from the path, far off but distinct. I looked in the direction of the noise, but it was too dark to see beyond the edge of the clearing. The footsteps grew louder in my direction. Then they suddenly stopped. For some nervous moments, I strained to hear a noise. It was as though someone was just out of sight, waiting and watching me. Then the footsteps started again, this time moving away from the campsite, but not back in the direction of the main trail. Whoever it was seemed to be circling around the clearing. The earlier nervousness returned in a rush. I looked around, attempting to catch sight of movement within the shadows, but the fire only cast light for a limited distance. I didn't have time to collect my thoughts before another pair of footsteps echoed through the night, this time from the other side. It was definite now that there were at least two people out there, stealthy, intentional. They weren't yelling or trying to make their presence obvious in any way. My chest tightened as I realized they were trying to hide. I reached for my pack and pulled out the handgun I always kept on me for a worst-case scenario. I rose to my feet, gun in full view, and turned in the direction of the trees where the closest footsteps had come from. I didn't say a word, hoping that the presence of a gun would be enough to frighten them away. The woods were silent. No footsteps, no whispering, just the snap of the flames. My eyes swept the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any sign of the intruders. They had to be out there, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, I began to collect my things, my hands trembling. I was quick but systematic, making sure to keep the gun near. I did not dare have my back to the woods for too long, thinking they could flood in at any moment. I left the tent behind, deciding it wasn't worth the risk to take the time to break it down. I shrugged my pack over one shoulder and crept closer to the trail. The silence was thick, but I knew they were there. I waited until I was a safe distance away before turning on my flashlight, not wanting to give away my exact location. The moment I was safely far enough away from the campsite, I turned on the light and increased my pace. The walk back to the parking lot was terrifying, every snap of a twig or groan of a branch causing my heart to skip a beat. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat for a bit, trying to catch my breath. The drive home was a blur. I did go to the local authorities and report the incident, but there really wasn't much they could do. Technically, no crime had been committed, and without any physical evidence, there was no means of discovering who was out there. Looking back, I have no doubt that those people meant ill will. They weren't lost hikers or stray campers. What they were doing was too intentional, too threatening. I haven't gone camping alone since that night. Nature can be peaceful and beautiful, but it is also ruthless. You never know what or who is lurking out there. A couple years back, I borrowed my brother Alex's RV for a speedy little vacation on my own. Alex lives just 15 minutes from me, and he's always willing to lend the RV out to me whenever I want to spend some time in the great outdoors. Living in a state renowned for its natural scenery, I've taken complete advantage of the mountains, forests, and lakes within easy access. This trip was a bit different though. It was late autumn, and the weather had turned cold, too cold to camp out in a tent. I didn't want to wake up with icy equipment, so the RV was perfect. I was eyeing a small, isolated fishing lake about an hour out of town. It was the kind of place where you could spend the day fishing and the evening just relaxing and enjoying the stillness. The trip to the pond was uneventful, though the road into it was nothing but a dirt road as thin as a bike path. It was obvious the road wasn't designed for vehicles, but tire marks told me others had been there before. The site was empty when I arrived, no other vehicle or camper around. That was just fine with me. I didn't feel like being with anyone. I left the RV on the edge of the field, retrieved my fishing gear, and went straight to the water. The first few hours were absolute heaven. The breeze was crisp, the water was calm, and one could only hear the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface and the leaves blowing on the wind. I spent late afternoon sitting with a few fish that I had caught and mentally preparing dinner. I was stowing away my gear when I noticed an old, beat-up pickup truck pull up along the road. The truck was nothing special. Its paint was cracked, and it had obviously had better days. The windows were blacked out with heavy tint, so you couldn't see who was in there. The driver parked in the field, far enough away that we wouldn't have any sort of direct contact, but close enough so I couldn't ignore that they were there. At first, I just thought they were out fishing or enjoying the view like me. It wasn't out of the ordinary for people to sleep in their cars on a ride like this. However, something about this did not seem right. The truck's engine sputtered and died, but no one exited. It occurred to me to stand up and go over, maybe make some introduction, and ease the tension so that it wouldn't be so awkward. But after a few minutes passed and no one did get out of the truck, I left them alone. I retreated into the RV for the evening, periodically looking out the window to see what had happened to the truck. It hadn't budged. The lights remained off, and the field darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time I got into bed, I assured myself it was likely nothing to concern myself with. I was abruptly jolted awake in the dead of night by the banging of a car door. My heart raced inside of me as I sat up and looked out the window. The truck stayed parked in the same location, but there was no one around outside. I froze for an instant, listening for more noises, but the night was silent. At last, I convinced myself that it must have been the wind or maybe an animal brushing against the truck. I turned around and went back to bed and tried to sleep. The next morning, the truck was still parked where it had stopped the night before. Nobody seemed to have moved it or even stepped outside. I decided to fish in the daytime again, but the fear the night before still lingered. Sometimes I glanced back at the truck. I couldn't help but think that whoever was inside was watching my every step. They never moved or said a word, but you could sense the tension. By mid-afternoon, I'd had it. I gathered up my gear and went back to the RV, locking the doors. As the sun began to set, I heard the sound of the truck engine roaring to life. I looked out of the window and watched as the vehicle crept on slowly ahead before coming to a stop in the middle of the trail that curled back along to the main road. For a moment, it seemed as if they were leaving, but then the engine was turned off, and the driver's door opened. A guy came out, sprinting quickly to the bed of the truck and grabbing something I couldn't see. My stomach knotted up as I noticed he stood in front of the RV, crowbar held against it. I locked the door and quickly made my way over to the driver's seat, my heart pounding. When I put the key in the ignition, the footsteps of the man running against the gravel outside could be heard. He reached the door and started tugging at the handle, rattling the entire RV. My brain clouded with fear, but I managed to switch the RV into gear. I floored it, inching closer to his truck, which was blocking my way. The guy ran to the driver's side of his truck and tried to get in before I could push it out of my way. I didn't slow down. The RV's front bumper smashed into the truck, nudging it off the narrow trail. The man desperately tried to re-enter the truck, but too late. I passed the truck, my heart racing as I took the bumpy road back to the highway. I traveled quite a distance before I stopped to ensure I was safe. Once I got on the highway, I called the police and reported what had happened. When they arrived at the pond, the truck and the man were gone. Even now, I never do know what he had in mind. Maybe he was planning to steal from me, but the activities, going out of his way for a whole day to track me and get himself ready with a trap, seemed threatening. Whatever it was, I'm glad I acted quickly. Since then, I've not camped by myself, and I never think I will again.